Thanks, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be back presenting at the IFS. And before I start, I should say what I'm presenting here is my own views, not those of the government, even though I'm working at the Treasury now. And also, thanks to the Office for National Statistics for the census data that we're using. It's not their views either. Okay, so the motivation for this piece of work and its relation to this theme of intergenerational rebalancing comes from the fact that over the past half century or more, we've seen a big boom in household wealth to income ratios. In the UK, that was most visible from a doubling in house price to household earnings ratio over the period roughly between the early 1990s and the mid 2010s. I'm illustrating that on that left-hand chart here. The solid line shows you that in the 1980s and indeed for decades before that, the average house sold for about 4 times the average annual household income. That then increased up to something around 8 to 10 times by the time of the financial crisis, and it stayed around there. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the home ownership rates for individuals aged 30 to 36 over the same period. So one of the sort of very well-documented trends, which I see being discussed in the media, is the decline in home ownership rates for young people, declining from about 3/4 for this age group in around 1990 to about a half by the mid-2010s. But I'm also showing some other patterns on these charts, and that is some differences both across the country in terms of the rate of house price growth, and also within different types of families in terms of the changes in home ownership rates. So on the left-hand side, seeing house price growth accelerated much more rapidly in high productivity parts of the country, such as London and the southeast of England. You see there that top dotted line accelerating up to around 16 times household earnings. And this is the earnings for people living in those regions. And that compares to house price growth, which was much more modest in areas like the northeast of England. So kind of raising issues about whether this house price growth is both making it more difficult to buy a house, but also potentially more difficult to move to and live in higher productivity parts of the country. There's also a intergenerational and inequality component to this. So while we see this decline in home ownership rates, we also see that it was more rapid for the children of those who did not own their own home. So this decline in these triangles is much greater for the children of renters than for the children of homeowners. So feeding into this idea that in order to get your foot on the housing ladder, potentially being able to move to high productivity parts of the country, it matters if you come from a position of wealth. But of course, as we saw in the first talk, there's lots of things that family background does. So disentangling whether this is really a wealth story is something that we want to get into. So just to make things a bit more concrete, we want to ask in this piece of research whether this UK house price boom, this big explosion in the amount of wealth, might have itself played a role in driving increased intergenerational persistence in outcomes like home ownership and wealth. We know that the choice of where to live and home ownership choices are closely related to people's careers. So we then want to ask whether there might have been implications of this house price boom for young people's location and career choices, and therefore potentially downstream impacts on the relationship between someone's earnings and their levels of parental wealth. And finally, this is much more a work in progress or for future further work. What policies might intervene on this process and would increase intergenerational mobility in home ownership and wealth, if that is an aim of a policymaker, as is indeed it is a stated aim of this and many previous governments. So what do we do to try and shed some light on these questions in this paper? So what we're going to do, first of all, is to estimate the effects of house prices in a local area, the house prices that someone faces, and also the effects of parents' housing wealth on children's adulthood outcomes, including their housing, location, and career choices. And we're going to be looking at ages 28 to 37, it's kind of early adulthood. And of course, I'm going to get into this in much more detail later on. But in a nutshell, the way that we're going to get at causal identification of the role of parental wealth and house prices is to use geographic variation in the house price boom, which meant that some parts of the country and those who owned homes there saw bigger uplifts in their wealth than others. In terms of the findings, we find that if, as a young person, you face local house prices that are £100,000 higher, that reduces your probability of being a homeowner. So that's a kind of direct effect that is probably quite predictable. But what we kind of want to emphasize a bit more is this sort of second channel through which a young person might be exposed to a house price boom through the effects that it has on their parents and their parents' impacts on parents' wealth's impacts on them. So we find that having £100,000 higher parental wealth causes no substantial increase in home ownership. So you're not more likely to own a home as a young person if you have parents with more housing wealth. However, you are more likely to have more housing wealth, i.e. a more expensive home. And that's explained not by owning a different type, like a larger house, but by owning in a more expensive part of the country. And so we show that parents having higher wealth causes young people to be more likely to live in high productivity parts of the country, London and the Southeast. And for young men, parental wealth causes increased likelihood of being a top earner. And I'll show some results that show that these things are linked. So in moving to these high productivity parts of the country, you enter higher earning occupations and are more likely to be a top earner. And finally, speaking to the mechanism behind this, we find that parents who are wealthier make larger financial transfers to their children. I'm then going to set out an overlapping generations model of parents and children with inter vivos structures and bequests and choices of location, which have implications for earnings and house prices. And in this model, I'll show that when we have some key ingredients, which is to say, when the earnings gains from moving to high productivity locations are somewhat backloaded. So if I move to London, that doesn't just mean that I earn more, but it means that I'm on a steeper earning trajectory. That's something that's empirically true. And when parents are able to make gifts to young children, which provides liquidity to help overcome borrowing constraints to fund moves to high house areas, high house price areas, I'm going to show in the context of this model that this can be a new mechanism that drives intergenerational persistence. And I'll show some comparative statics about how that changes when there is a house price boom induced by a decline in interest rates. So this piece of research relates to, contributes to literature on the drivers of intergenerational mobility. I think what we're doing that's new here is kind of considering these channels where there's the interaction between house prices, location, and earnings choices, and putting forward a new mechanism essentially that can drive intergenerational persistence in outcomes through the dynamics of the housing market. This it is also building on papers looking at transmission of housing price shocks, now looking at the sort of intergenerational element. And this also speaks to the literature thinking about spatial sorting and housing supply and house prices, and links that to this intergenerational literature. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set out a few, set out the data I'm going to use and some of the key descriptive patterns that we see there, which kind of motivate the empirical investigation and then the later model. So I'm going to show the results, then talk about the model. At the moment, that's just a theoretical framework for thinking and interpreting the results, but in the future, hopefully it could be estimated and used for policy counterfactuals. Okay, so some key facts that come from the prior literature based in the UK. We find that intergenerational mobility is relatively low in the UK internationally speaking. It's sort of lower than in Europe, similar to in the USA. And intergenerational persistence of home ownership in particular has been increasing over time, i.e. mobility has been falling. And while intergenerational persistence in wealth can be, in a descriptive sense, somewhat explained by kind of standard human capital channels, the persistence of earnings between parents and children, there is a large residual relationship between the wealth of parents and the wealth of children that is not explained in a simple statistical sense by the earnings relationship between parents and children, so suggestive of some direct role for wealth. Geographic mobility in early adulthood is quite significant, particularly for more highly educated people. 40% of graduates have moved from their kind of childhood location by age 30, and a quarter of those who move go to London, which is an important labour market for young professionals. Importantly, for the way that we're thinking about this, moves to London have been shown to cause not only higher earnings, but higher earnings progression. There's also a lot of evidence that parental wealth transfers are closely related to home purchase. And this trend, whereby house prices have increased relative to incomes, has meant that the amount that must be put down in a down payment in order to buy a house has increased substantially compared to young people's incomes over the decades that I'm looking at. And there's a substantial role for parental transfers in contributing to those financial resources. Half of all inter vivos transfers are reported as being used for property purchase in the UK. And in some prior work, we've also showed that the receipt of transfers is related to moving between different parts of the country and also entering self-employment. So that linked to these other choices. But what we're trying to do is evidence the idea that direct parental wealth transfers might be having an impact on housing and career choices, and that is a mechanism of intergenerational persistence. So to do that, we're going to use a few different bits of data. The first is the longitudinal study of linked censuses. This uses the UK decennial census, and it's a 1% sample of each birth year, which is then linked as a panel. And what's particularly nice for our purposes is that when we get the census records not only of the individual, but all of the people in the household that they are living in. So when you are a child living with your parents, we see your parents' census records. We then see your census records when you go into adulthood. So we're going to see parents and children's home ownership status, the type of house they live in, the location, very fine occupational classification. That's going to allow us to pretty well impute house value and earnings. And we're going to do that using the universe of housing transactions. I'll get onto this later, but we're going to be using newly estimated housing supply elasticities as a way of instrumenting for local house prices. And then to get at the transfers mechanism, I'm going to use also some survey data, the Wealth and Asset Survey, where we observe a lot of information about parents and children's wealth, but crucially transfers of wealth made and received. And we're also going to be able to link people with very fine geographical identifiers.
Okay, this is really very interesting. I wonder if you could just say whether in those variables which you just put up there, do you do anything about studying the increase in the number of single-parent households, the fact that more than 50% of children are born out of wedlock, and what sort of impact that's having in terms of the actual structure of that ownership environment and how it exists? Shouldn't it be a variable?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's measured in the data in the sense that I measure who your parents are, and be sort of in the empirical analysis, sort of controlling for things that you're describing. I guess, yeah, on a deeper level, what could the implications of that be? Yeah, I suppose there might also, it might be a sort of a driver of kind of inequalities in parental wealth as well. If sort of certain types of people or certain types of families more likely to be single parent families, and therefore sort of accumulate less wealth. Yeah, I should think about it more. It's sort of there in the background in what I'm doing.
So what do you do about migrants?
Yeah, it's a great point. This is basically, you should think of this as a study of those who are living continuously in England.
But what fraction of the population do you exclude by that? I'm just curious. I don't know the data.
I don't know. I should know that, and I don't know the number. Yeah, I don't know the number. So the sample that I'm using from the longitudinal study, I'm going to think of it as three different cohorts of children. So I'm going to have the later post-boom cohort. So those are the people who kind of enter adulthood after this big increase in house prices. They're going to be born between 1974 and 1982 and observed, for my purposes, in the 1991 and 2011 census. The sort of idea behind this choice of age group is to get a sort of decade cohort who will be at ages in 1991, 8 to 17, where they're going to be living with their parents. So there's basically no selection into who is matched to their parents at those ages. And then 20 years later, they're going to be aged 28 to 37. So hopefully old enough that we're kind of seeing some meaningful adulthood outcomes. And then the other two cohorts are basically just taking everything back by 10 years, take everything back by 20 years. In a lot of the empirical results, I'm just going to use the earliest and latest cohorts kind of for simplicity, but it doesn't really change anything whether I include the middle one as well. In the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over this, but we can impute into the data, I think, pretty well your primary housing wealth and your earnings.
So you're taking the boom is somehow exogenous in this analysis, is that it?
Yeah, well, the way I think about the boom, and we will get onto this, is that it's at a sort of macro level driven by the secular decline in safe interest rates, which is kind of a global phenomenon driven by all sorts of factors like aging and US inequality. How much the severity of it varies across different areas of the country, depending on the elasticity of housing supply in those areas. That's my stylized way of thinking about it.
But not related to shocks specific to industries or the kind of human capital that parents have?
Yeah, I mean that will also be driving things. And so and that is, I guess, a possible kind of confounding thing. We'll see when we get to the estimation. If house price growth in an area is kind of driven by like a booming industry or a declining industry, that can be a problem, and that's how we're going to use supply elasticities to instruments for the effects we're getting. But I'll get on to that.
Yeah, just that there is a transmission of skill by occupation of the parent, right?
Yeah.
And that if one is declining and others
Yeah.
booming, there's another mechanism here which is possibly at work. I don't know if you investigated it, that's all.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I mean, in practice, I'm just going to be kind of controlling out for those things because I can control for parents' occupation times the generation. So it's another channel which I'm not really examining here, but I have to be very careful at.
Well, just thinking also just about the expectations of the children. They're in a coal mining town where there's been a serious decline. Their notion is very different from if they're in a high-tech environment where everything is booming and money is free, relatively free.
Yeah, I mean that definitely affects their prospects. I mean, the question I guess the experiment I have in mind is like, what if in either the poor or the booming community, if you give one family a bit more wealth, what does it do to the kids?
I understand, but I just wonder how they get the wealth seems to make a matter here in terms of intimidation, that's all.
I see.
Why the wealth increases, that's all.
Yes.
You're gonna be very silent about that, Chair.
Okay.
I'm just trying to understand what you're doing.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to imagine like a pure bump to
I
wealth.
understand, a helicopter drop
Yeah,
housing wealth.
yeah. But yeah, there's also a lot of interesting questions about the
Right.
markets. I should probably speed up a little bit. This is just showing some descriptive patterns on intergenerational systems, kind of rank outcome times graphs. Kind of a takeaway is that the intergenerational correlation in home ownership increased across these generations, and the relationship between your parents' housing wealth rank and your later life earnings also increased across these generations. Perhaps slightly more interestingly here, let's just focus on the bottom part first of all. I'm showing by parents' wealth for two different generations, the probability that you move to London if you started off living outside of London. And what it's showing is that there's an increase in the rate of people moving to London across these generations, but it's particularly concentrated among the children of the wealthy. Conversely, moves outside of London have dropped, particularly for the children of the less wealthy. Okay, so now getting on to this, the empirical method. Let's fix ideas, think about the outcome being child's housing wealth, or maybe whether the child owns a home or not. We're going to think of this as being a function of the child's characteristics, their parents' characteristics, and what we're interested in, the parents' housing wealth, that the house prices that the child faces. So I should have said J is the area that the child is living in. So this is picking up the house prices of the area that that child I is living in at time t. And also, we're going to think about the child's outcomes as being driven by the location. Here, to fix ideas, the location that they grew up in. So where they were in the period t minus s. So s for us is going to be 20. Where were you 20 years before your adulthood outcomes were observed? And then, of course, there's a sort of bunch of taste and ability factors too. And there's going to be some empirical challenges to getting at the effects of parents' wealth and of local house prices. There's a number of different things, but some that you can think of. So epsilon is going to be probably correlated with the local house prices that you face and your parents' wealth. So, for example, if I really want to buy a house, then maybe I'll choose to move to a lower price location to make sure that I can afford one. If my parents particularly liked being in a big fancy house, maybe I'll share that taste and that will drive my housing decisions. So what we want to do to try and get around this is, first of all, so thinking about house prices to get around the fact that I might choose where to live, we're going to instrument for the prices that I face with the prices, the current prices in the area that I grew up in. To get at the effects of parents' housing wealth, we're then going to get at the difference between the children of homeowners and renters who grew up in the same location. So that is to say, we're going to instrument for parental wealth with the interaction of whether your parents owned a home when you were young and the current house prices in the area that you grew up in. There's also some challenges coming from the fact that child's location effects are likely going to be correlated with house prices and parental wealth. So if the area that I grew up in had great schools, then that's going to affect my later outcomes in all sorts of different ways. Also going to affect the level of house prices there. This also speaks to Jim's point about certain areas perhaps having better or worse labor markets, and that, of course, is going to feed through to your outcomes as well as house prices. And because we're looking at multiple generations in our data, we can be quite flexible here, and we can basically include a bunch of area fixed effects, and indeed we can allow those fixed effects to also be interacted with whether your parents were homeowners or renters. Intuitively, what are we doing there? We're then using changes in house prices over time across areas. So what's the differential in house price growth over time across different areas for identification. So thinking about house prices, the question is, if I grew up in an area where house prices grew faster or slower, how are my outcomes affected? And if we're getting at parental wealth, how is that differential by the area that I grew up in? How does that in turn vary by whether or not my parents owned a home when I was younger, and therefore whether I'm exposed to that sort of indirect channel via my parents' wealth? So that I guess the sort of crucial assumption here is that there are not shocks to local areas that are correlated with house price growth. And in the case of identifying the effects of parental wealth, there's not shocks to local areas that are correlated with house price growth and affect the children of homeowners and renters differentially.
Just a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Are there changes, is there variation across region in terms of mortgage rates, the cost of borrowing for a house? And secondly, is there any variation in the supply of public housing across these areas that might affect the housing price of that area? In other words, I know there's been a reform, but I don't remember which way it went, and I don't know the magnitudes of any of these.
Yes, there will be. I mean, like the right to buy reform, which kind of going on sort of throughout. Well, would have been bedding in throughout time. I'm sure that wasn't different across different areas. So, yeah, it's a good question, I suppose. So the concern that you might have, I guess, would be that sort of the selection into who is a homeowner,
right,
is different, is changing differentially across areas, across generations.
Right.
So
especially policies targeted towards disadvantaged areas or some places where they're trying to help in terms of public housing or even subsidy for rent.
That's a good point. So what we do, which I haven't set this out here, is that we can include fixed effects for slightly larger regions by generation, by parent type, which means that I'm exploiting comparisons kind of within, say, a slightly larger region like London and the Southeast, in which I would hope that these kind of things are a bit more similar. So then I'm just exploiting variation in house price growth, say, within London and Southeast, rather than kind of comparing quite different regions with different policies. But it's a good one.
But those fixed effects are obscuring the possible effects of those policies, are both mortgage policy and public housing policy and other policies concerned rentals or public.
Yes.
And
so
I just don't know the housing market situation in Britain at all. So
yes, I mean the mortgage market I wouldn't think would be so different across regions, but I should think more about this change in availability of social housing across generations, change differentiate across regions. Yeah, I think it's probably important. Yeah.
And also a bit more, please, about how rental levels are fitted in this and why, for example, we haven't included them because the choice between buying a home and renting or the ability of somebody to move because of the level of rents.
Yeah.
It feels to me that decision has been affected by the relative level of rental requirements over time. Whereas I know sort of my generation, again, said before, as I came from a seaside town of Brady Pride, it was really easy to go to London because the rents weren't that bad.
Yes.
About 8 people living in a house, and then we found ways around it. So you're kind of missing out. The tasteability bit is also a function of a whole set of things which have changed over time. But just on the rental thing, house price to rental, mortgage rental, I think is quite an important one.
Yeah. So agree with that. The way that I was thinking about it is that local house prices and local rents are closely linked. So I'm kind of capturing differences in either one. I can kind of include one and not the other. Those are so closely related. So I think it's kind of should be capturing that.
Could I just ask a question about state intervention? I'm thinking of the residence mill rate band in inheritance tax, which for those who are unfamiliar with it, is a inheritance tax allowance specifically designed to benefit the children of homeowners. if I die and leave my home to my children, then the estate is not taxable up to £175,000. But that was introduced 9 years ago or so. I just wonder, strictly in your capacity as an economist who happens to work on housing, whether you had a comment on that. Because I guess it probably doesn't show up very much in your data, but presumably it would contribute to the inequality towards in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of late in the data period. I suppose, yeah, like you say, on the margin, there's a bit more incentive to pass on housing wealth in your bequests as a result of that. Yes, it's a nice thought. It makes me think it could be the sort of thing that it'd be interesting to bring into this project actually. I guess in my IFS capacity, I would have said it's not a good policy. So okay, I'm going a bit too slowly. So basically, what I think I will talk through the IB strategy. I'm going to make with two SLS and going to be using a bunch of how these component characteristics and a very rich set of parental characteristics, including line occupation codes, education, and all of these can be like very flexibly interacted with generation and region, as I was saying. I'm just going to skip on to showing the results because they also help to illustrate what's going on. Okay, I'm just going to build up showing the results, which also kind of illustrates the identification and thinking about the effects of parental housing wealth on child's housing wealth. So here what I'm showing is for the post-boom cohort, the average level of child's housing wealth amongst those whose parents owned their own home. And I've ranked all of the parents by house price growth over the boom 20 years in the local area that the parents, ranked by house price growth in the area that you grew up in. So that's all sort of identifying variation. Further to the right, your parents received a bigger boost to their wealth. So unsurprisingly, the children who grew up in areas that saw a bigger house price boom were wealthier themselves. But as we're discussing, there's lots of things that could drive a house price boom in a certain area and also drive child outcomes. What we do is then to look at the same average level of child housing wealth amongst the children of renters, again, ranked in the same way. So again, sort of unsurprisingly, the children of homeowners are wealthier, but the kind of important thing is that this gap between the two groups is larger the more the house prices grew over the boom period in the area that the parents were located and the child grew up. So the idea here, this is kind of telling us that there is a role for housing wealth per se. Now you might be sort of concerned that there are factors that might kind of affect might benefit the children of wealthier people differentially. Perhaps a booming labour market of a certain type is going to be good for house prices, but also going to be something that children of homeowners can take more advantage of. So we're also going to do the same thing, ranking by the elasticity of housing supply in the local area of the parents. So here, the claim is that what's driving house prices is kind of geographical features of the region, of the area, which is much more plausibly not having a direct effect on the child's later outcomes. Yeah.
And do you have really like earnings of these days? So
I guess home ownership is probably correlated with early life earnings because of human capital accumulation. And I'm trying to think through the issue that I guess if kids are live in London and they're more likely to be, born to high income parents and have jobs in London and the like. And it seems as though there's testable exclusion restrictions in terms of the life cycle growth of earnings for these kids.
Oh, so you kind of want to know they have less steam range, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, we're going back to, I guess some areas have gotten destroyed in terms of coal, the coal dust and a lot of these areas, whether or not the parent owned a home, that the kid's in big trouble.
right. Okay. Yeah.
And it seems as though you can do a little bit to test whether there's strong links early in life in terms of earnings of these kids between renters and non-renters.
Yes, I'm going to do that. Okay, and then so we see these gaps opening up. We also want to establish or I can also show that these gaps are not present amongst the pre-boom generation. So this is not sort of something else just about the types of parents that move into these particular areas or something like that. At least if it were, it would have to be something that started at the same time as the house price boom.
So this is me. I'm over-interpreting bit scatter. This is like the reduced form, and it's very nonlinear. I'm just wondering if is the first stage also has that nonlinearity. Like it's driven entirely by the low.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. First stage have that non-linearity. I don't know actually. It's a good question.
Because otherwise it's basically flat as a function of elasticity from 20% of the sort of question, I guess, but
yeah, fair question. Fair question. I should look into that. Yeah. Okay. Showing similar charts for the home ownership rate. The basic takeaway is that these gaps do not change as we move from the left to the right. So having higher parental wealth doesn't seem to affect whether or not you own a home. And here just sort of showing the formal results. So first of all, just doing a simple OLS. If your parents are wealthier, you're more likely to be a homeowner. If you face higher prices, you're less likely to be a homeowner. That diminishes with some controls, but doesn't go away. Oh, doesn't like that slide. If we then do the IV specification, where we're instrumenting with local house prices and the interaction of local house prices and parental ownership at baseline, we find no effect. And then doing the version where we instrument with the interaction of the house price elasticity and the year of observation, then we see sort of negative effect of house prices on home ownership, but again, no discernible effect of parental wealth on home ownership.
Can you check the amount of effect you get on parents having wealth on people who's growing at home? That maybe you observe these people at 2 ages, like reach kind of childhood, and then in adulthood up to 38. Is that right?
Yeah, 37.
37. Is it potentially driven by people becoming homeowners later?
It could be, and yeah, now I've got another decade of the census data just dropped, so I can investigate that. Like homeownership rates are pretty much flattened off, like on aggregate by that age, but doesn't mean that it's not something else going on underneath. Then turning to the equivalent charts for wealth, the takeaway here is strong correlations between parents' wealth and child's wealth. But we are saying there is this estimated causal impact, whereby there's a pass-through of between about 10 to 15% between the parents' housing wealth and the child's housing wealth. So given that children are not caused to be more likely to be homeowners, but do have higher valued homes, how can that be? We don't really find any consistent evidence that they're in larger types of houses. So we have a house type in the census. But one thing that does start to emerge is that having wealthier parents makes you more likely to own a home in London. Here in this chart, what I'm showing is a bunch of estimates where the outcome is whether or not you own a home in a given region. That's the grey bars. And I'm doing this for a bunch of different administrative regions in England. And it's the effect of £100,000 of parental wealth and whether you own a home in this region. And we find there's this positive effect for London and the South East and kind of no sort of significant effect in other areas. And this also seems to be driven by people being more likely to move to London if their parents were wealthier. In terms of, with this, just digging into a little bit what's driving this housing wealth effect, and we're also able to look at whether some other potentially mediating factors explain this effect of parents' wealth on child's wealth. This is simply just adding in some controls to see if it diminishes the coefficient on the parents' wealth. We find that adding in kind of human capital measures, earnings, and university education doesn't do much, nor does adding in the binary for home ownership. But whether you own in London is kind of explaining about half of the relationship. This is when we're using local prices as the instrument. If we instrument using the elasticity, then it explains even more. So given there seems to be this effect on sort of choosing to move to London and own a home there, might that also come with some effects on occupation and earnings? Looking just simply at, is there an effect on your earnings in pounds? We find no kind of discernible effect of parental wealth. If we look at whether or not you're in work, there is some negative effect. So maybe that's the Carnegie effect showing up in this data set. And when we look at long earnings, we find a positive effect of parental housing wealth. So this kind of suggests there might be some different effects in terms of the extensive margin and then earnings conditional work. So to drill into that, here I'm looking at the effect of parental wealth on earning in various quantiles of the earnings distribution. And I've split this by gender. Let's focus on the men here, first of all, in blue. What we're seeing is a kind of decline in being a middle earner, an increased likelihood of being in the top 20%, and in fact, that's driven mainly by being more likely to be an earner in the top 5% of the earnings distribution. For women, there's not so much action going on further up the earnings distribution, but you're maybe slightly more likely to be in the bottom, which is basically to be not in work. So that sort of Carnegie effect, if it is that, seems to be there for women. Maybe something to investigate a bit more. So now I'm just going to try to drill down a bit into this earnings effect and see if it's related to movement to London. And so to do that, I'm going to look at the effect of parental wealth on working in certain occupations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to group occupations and also split out between those who are working in London in that occupation and those who are working elsewhere in that occupation. And in this chart, which may be a little bit complicated now I think about it, I'm showing on the vertical axis the estimated effect of parental wealth on working in that occupation. And on the horizontal axis, the average earnings of an educated male working in that occupation. And what I want you to take away is a couple of things. So there are some occupations where there's increased prevalence of working there that are not sort of particularly high earning. That includes working in London in culture, media, and sports occupations. That's things like journalism and the arts and media. There are also some occupations like business where having wealthier parents means that you're less likely to work in that occupation outside of London. That's these grey circles down here, and you're more likely to be working in that occupation in London. So, and those occupations are paid significantly more in London than outside. So this suggests that people who have wealthier parents are kind of sorting into higher paid occupations, which is in particular is sort of the interaction of an occupation at a location. So working in finance, in business, in law, in London is particularly well paid. Final couple of results.
For example, commutation costs, cost of housing, for example. And so,
yeah.
I just wondered what the net welfare, some measure of welfare rather than just
earnings. Yeah. It's a good point. I mean, I haven't done this, but some people showed that you have to be kind of pretty far up the earnings distribution in London for it to just net of housing costs for you to be doing better. So I think this sort of takes us on to the question of the sort of dynamics of it as well, and the fact that maybe it's not just your current, but also your future earnings that matter, because these people are kind of in their 30s, but maybe they're unlocking a kind of a higher earning whole career.
But you have existing data to get some idea of wage growth in those occupations, don't you?
Yes.
So what the option
yes.
might be to enter those occupations.
Yes. So that is something I should quantify. Yeah. So we could do a sort of lifetime earnings or lifetime welfare effect, kind of using other data to say what that's going to do for you.
I mean, do you have any data, for example, on families where one child moves to London, the other child doesn't, or whether or not there's any kind of sibling design that might be helpful in isolating some of these effects?
Not with this data, fortunately, because it's not structured that way. You don't see the other siblings later into life. I'll say briefly, parental wealth means that you're more likely to be self-employed. You're also more likely to be self-employed with employees, which is a kind of a measure of being like a business owner. So kind of suggestive there that there's also some effect on business startup. And the final bit for these empirical results, I'm giving this story that wealthier parents are like helping their children to buy houses in these high productivity, high house price areas and earn more. Using the same research design, we see that if parents are wealthier, that causes them not to be more likely to give a gift to their children, but they give more. They give larger gifts. So at least on the face of it, some evidence that this channel is at play. I haven't really left myself enough time to go through the model, so I'll maybe just try and give you the following. So that some of the benefits of moving to a location are backloaded. So future earnings trajectory gets steeper if you move to London. There are costs of moving to locations that must be paid upfront. So that could just simply be rent or a down payment on a house. There are some borrowing constraints, so I can't fully bring forward that future earnings to pay for the rent of the house. And there are parents who can make wealth transfers. Then in a general equilibrium OLG model, this can establish a link between parental resources and child's location choices, because if parents make transfers out of their wealth, then they might ease the liquidity constraints that would mean that a child might choose to move to a place that has higher housing costs and benefits in terms of higher future earnings. This can be a mechanism that increases the generational persistence of income and can lead to the misallocation of skills, because at the margin, it's going to mean that sorting into high productivity locations is slightly more related to parental wealth rather than the child's own skills.
But when is the transfer made within the lifetime of the child? We were talking earlier about the fact that a lot of this wealth is acquired at the end.
Yes.
And the kids have already made a lot of these decisions, facing liquidity constraints. So they're not being relieved in the same way they would be if they were inter vivos transfers of the 30s, for example.
I agree. So both are important. And I show in the model actually that if the wealth is given more as bequests, that can actually ameliorate. It goes in the opposite direction. But as I just showed, we see that parents do make in vivos transfers. They might not be as big as the bequests, but it seems big enough to cause parental wealth to be relieving those constraints and causing children to move to higher productive locations.
Yeah, one of the things, I have a paper with Ron High, where we show that high education, high ability parents actually face very serious credit constraints, not against in the sense of absolute value, but in the sense of borrowing against their future wealth. Because, trying to establish your credibility with a bank when you're 30 years old or 35 is very difficult. Yeah. And so literally what happens is there really are constrained people in the mid-30s. That's where the timing matters a lot.
Yeah. So I guess for me that it's the children who are in their late 20s, early 30s are credit constrained. Right. Their parents are in their 50s or 60s and they help them out.
They help them out. That's the question, though. It's the extent of which the transfers are occurring into vivos targeted to that period versus at the end of the life of the parent, which is typically older than 30, 35.
I agree. Yeah, both are important, but I just showing that the ex vivos are substantial and they respond to parents. They
respond to that need.
Yeah. So I probably run out of time now.
One more question. Sorry. And then
that's okay.
And then
on the earlier question, so how important is co-signing of loans in the UK? Because in my your financial transfer, it's just like owns a house, co-sign.
That's a great point. I mean, that would also kind of work in a similar way. I don't think it's like that common in sort of absolute terms. I think it's just emerged in the last few years. It probably didn't exist when this data was there, but it could become more important. Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. Have you considered the impact of, let's say, the top off of London prices over the last 10 years? I think they've actually fallen behind the rate of inflation. And secondly, what about the impact of government policy around inclusion of pensions within estates from 2027? Has that actually already started to show any impact in terms of parental behaviour increasing into vivos?
Yeah, that's a a great question. I mean, neither of those things are in this study because they were after it took place, but after the data. Yeah, I mean, I guess we have seen London prices come back like a little bit compared to. I think it's they're still substantially higher than other places. So yeah, I guess as interest rates have gone up, I didn't get into this, but we should sort of expect the mechanism to unwind a bit, basically, and that's probably what we're seeing now. And yeah, I think according to the Financial Times anyway, parents are sort of giving more as a result of, anticipating more of their estate being taxed. And that is something which I think it would be really great. Well, using the model, which I didn't really get to tell you about, parents would have a choice between the gifts and bequests, and you could imagine a sort of trade-off or thinking about taxing bequests, but actually, if that leads parents to give more into vivos, that might actually have a negative effect on intergenerational mobility by kind of strengthening the effect of parents on children's early adulthood choices. The reason being that parental wealth is going to be particularly important when you're credit constrained, which is early adulthood, as Jim was saying, and that's when into vivos transfers are made. Bequests aren't received until, generally speaking, the end of your working life. Okay, I'll kind of stop there. So higher house prices reduce home ownership, but they also have effect through the parental wealth channel, which is to increase kids' wealth by causing them to buy homes in London and the Southeast, enter higher earning occupations in the case of men. Suggested evidence at this point, I guess, that direct wealth transfers into vivos are a mechanism behind that, and you can kind of rationalize these patterns by a model in which there is some gain to moving to high productivity locations, which is backloaded, and parents can ease borrowing constraints. This raises kind of questions of policy about the effect of wealth transfer taxation on this process, and therefore even the efficient allocation of labour. It also has implications for how the elasticity of housing supply can impact intergenerational mobility and the allocation of skills in the economy. I'm out of time though, so I'll have to tell you about that in